Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as sceptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. In April 2022, the Unbelievable podcast did an episode discussion on evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I'll be playing through key sections of that conversation and interject with my own thoughts and reasoning for why I can't accept the claimed resurrection of Jesus. Link 1 in the show notes is the original episode if you wish to listen to it in its entirety. The guests on the show were Dale, Allison and Justin Bass. See links 2 and 3. Justin introduces the show with the following.
So we'll be asking what kind of evidence can history provide about the resurrection of Jesus. Dale and Justin, welcome along to the show today.
I'm not sure that history can provide any. Yes, the Bible does say that Jesus rose again, but can that be counted as historic evidence? I'm not convinced, which is why I'm doing this analysis. Bass opens up with,
felt the Lord call me and my family to move it and sell everything to go to the Middle East. This was in 2017, and we were there from 2017 to early 2020, and COVID basically ended my missionary career.
If God called him to be a missionary, why couldn't God intervene to ensure that COVID didn't put an end to this essential service? Is God really that weak? Bass's book is called The Bedrock of Christianity, where he says he lays out what scholars agree on. These agreements apparently lead to 4 facts that can be asserted, which he says are:
the bedrock sources, that would be Paul's early letters, would be Jesus' crucifixion. It would be the claim of the resurrection. It would be the appearances of Jesus, namely from the early creed, 1 Corinthians 15, appearance to Peter, appearance to the 12, minus Judas, appearance to more than 500, appearance to James, these multiple appearances recorded there. And then just the rise of the Christian movement. I mean, that's obviously the most undeniable one.
I won't discuss those claimed facts right now. I'll address specific points as they come up later in the episode. If you think those facts sounded familiar, host Justin thought so too.
Is this a sort of version of what's sometimes been called the minimal facts approach to the resurrection?
Andrew and I deal specifically with the minimal facts in episode 76, if you haven't already listened. Allison, the other guest, takes a more measured approach.
My goal is to contribute to an ongoing discussion, and I have no illusions that anything in my book will slow any of the discussions down at all. I do myself think that there is fiction mixed in with history in the resurrection accounts. However, at the end of the day...
This is refreshing to hear. Too many Christians take all of the gospel narrative as absolutely true, and Allison is bound to receive strong pushback for saying what he just said. But I applaud it. It's the most honest way to approach the Gospels. The critical question now becomes, how do we identify the fiction? On discussing the crucifixion, Bass says,
I don't know of anyone that denies, the fact that Jesus was crucified. Now, exactly when he was crucified,
which is fine, but then he gets specific and says,
and if it was 33, then it would have been April 3rd, AD 33, which is incredible. We can get to the exact day. I've been reading a book by Colin Humphreys. I don't know if you've read his book, Dale, on the mysteries of the Last Supper. He's from Cambridge, but he's using astronomical evidence of the fact that there was a lunar eclipse even on April 3rd, AD 33.
The lunar eclipse of 33 AD is problematic. Lunar eclipses happen when the Earth is between the Sun and the Moon. So in order to experience the lunar eclipse, the Sun will have set, which throws out the timeline for the events of the day. Jesus' body would have already been taken off the cross and be in the tomb by the time it was dark. This doesn't account for the darkness described while Jesus was still on the cross. This is the difficulty with trying to match the crucifixion narrative with natural events. They don't line up, which leaves one of two options. The narrative is fiction, or there is additional supernatural activity which is only reported in the biblical crucifixion narrative.
As Jesus was on the cross, they were looking up at a blood-red moon.
Moonrise would have been about 7 p.m, and already in eclipse with the sun having set. The moon would be on the horizon, not up in the sky. They would only be able to see the blood-red moon if they had a clear view of the horizon. Joseph of Arimathea has already asked for the body, so Jesus would unlikely be on the cross. He'd have been dead for several hours already. The eclipse would be over by the time the moon was up in the sky.
You'll occasionally find the offbeat person say, well, Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die, right? But that is only found, to my knowledge, in really offbeat literature, usually fiction.
I agree that Jesus could have survived the crucifixion and somehow escaped to recover for a few days and come back resurrected is not a serious objection to the narrative. There are better, more intellectual ways of addressing the fiction in this story. This isn't one of them. I've never seen anyone make this objection who I thought was being serious.
I think the Gospels are full of historical and information and are incredibly accurate in a lot of ways and are sourced in eyewitness testimony.
They may have some facts, but they also have fiction. How do we tell one from another? There might even be some eyewitness testimony. But which bits are they? We don't actually know who wrote the Gospels, much less who they used as their sources. We do not know the path the information took from being witnessed to eventually written down years later. We don't know how polluted those stories became during that journey, and we don't know which bits are complete fabrication. This assertion sounds more like wishful thinking than confirmable fact. When moving on to justify the resurrection, the conversation starts with,
They were not what you would expect Jewish people at that time to be claiming about someone they believed had been the Messiah but got themselves crucified.
You don't usually worship crucified men in ancient Israel.
This is true. It was not normal to worship a crucified criminal as the Messiah. Rather than this being indicative of the story being true, I suggest it's more indicative of the story being later embellished fiction from an obscure cult that broke into the big time.
I've always wondered about Mark 6. I don't know what it means. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how seriously it was taken. But there is the language of resurrection used for John the Baptist. Jesus is John the Baptist, come back from the dead. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if I should take it seriously.
This aside about John the Baptist is interesting. Briefly, the Mark 6 passage talks about Jesus apparently being mistaken for the resurrected John the Baptist, and then goes into a narrative of Herod being afraid of John the Baptist and keeping him alive in prison, and then goes into the story of the girl who asks for his head on a platter. There is clearly a chronology issue here, which isn't made explicitly clear. The most obvious Christian explanation is the part about John being beheaded is a past tense story explaining his death, but it isn't explicitly clear. The writing style is, frankly, not great literature and reads jumbled up. To me, Mark 6 reads like a passage with multiple authors over multiple time periods who haven't paid correct attention to context and style. This is exactly what you'd expect from a religion that grew slowly and has a holy text that evolved over time.
But pretty much across the literature I find of New Testament scholarship that 1 Corinthians 15, that creedal statement that Paul is quoting, goes back within, at most, the latest 10 years after Jesus' death. And, the late James Dunn, he said within months. So a spectrum of within months of Jesus' death to within 10 years of Jesus' death.
This 1 Corinthians 15 passage is certainly interesting. Does it date from only a few months after the alleged resurrection of Jesus? Were the disciples really that organised to start churches and creeds that soon? 1 Corinthians was apparently written about 20 years after the alleged resurrection of Jesus. However, the earliest complete version of 1 Corinthians is much later. So while it is possible that Paul wrote this letter about 50 BCE, and that the reference creed was passed on to him before that, we can't actually know when. So there is much to speculate on and little to be certain of. There is another fun fact to consider here. There are parts of the previous chapter that are considered by some to be a later insertion, specifically verses 34 and 35 of chapter 14. These are the ones that talk about a woman being not permitted to speak. So if these can be considered a later addition, then is it really hard to imagine that the creed verses being discussed here are also a later insertion? We can't know for sure. There is much that is lost to history that we will never know. So why stake a firm faith on something that can't be known with certainty? This questionable history of biblical passages is why I cannot take what it says to be literal truth.
Well, let's just put it this way. I think if you're a skeptic, you're doing yourself a disservice by doubting what's going on here in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. I think it makes more sense if you're a skeptic, which I'm not. It makes more sense to try to explain these things rather than explaining them away and saying, this didn't happen. So we do have a few people who just doubt the appearance to the 500. I don't think they should be doing that.
I'm a skeptic, and I doubt the appearance to the 500. Why? Because this is the only place it appears. There are no details of anyone who was there. No name, no locations, nothing. Just a single, simple comment that it happened. Add to this the unverifiable nature of the history of this passage, and we end up with an event that has zero positive evidence in support of it, and a few reasons why it can be legitimately doubted. Believing that it actually occurred is the least reasonable option. I am under no obligation to explain it, and I don't need to explain it away either. I am content to say that the text is vague and questionable enough that I can simply doubt it happened and move on.
Luther said he went through the wall, or he just dissipated. He doesn't, whatever it is, he doesn't have a body like you or I have it. But Calvin actually thinks he does, right? And there are a lot of theologians in the tradition who think this. So the whole thing puzzles me, but you can see where my doubts are coming.
If respected theologians can't agree on basic things, then why should I believe anything about the resurrected Jesus? I've been told by various Christians that God has given us enough in the Bible that we should all be able to believe. But when high-profile theologians, who have studied these texts far more than I ever could, simply can't agree on basics, why should I even bother with the important parts? If the Bible is so lacking in detail that basic elements are seen as not recorded reliably, why should I even begin to trust it on the important parts? Since the Bible reads exactly like a mishmash of human texts jumbled together to form a barely coherent narrative, why should I ever consider it to be inspired by a perfect God who wants me to love him? I can't do it. I can't make that leap. And I am baffled why anyone else would.
Originally, it seems that if the book of Acts is telling us the truth, and I think it is, that it's like a sect of Judaism. And like I said, maybe they were called the Nazarenes. And it was a small sect. And it probably, wasn't even that large compared to maybe some of the other, Mithraism and other, mystery religions and other things throughout the 2nd and even into the 3rd century. But eventually, against all odds, this movement then becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. And I just find that that's another just, to me, compelling evidence that, if Jesus rose from the dead, it would make sense to me that he would continue, not only would his movement continue to endure, but it would also triumph.
All religions have to start somewhere. And since all religions start from a small sect, it follows that one of them, one day, will become the largest and most popular one. But popularity doesn't equate to being right. This is why skeptical former believers exist. We've realised that it takes more than simply being the most popular to be right. Us doubters and skeptics require a methodology of validating the claims and central tenets.
Historically, it makes sense to me why Islam continued to triumph. I can't see historically why this movement got going, unless you have something, you agree, extraordinary, but I would say the resurrection of Jesus and then the continued power and guidance behind that to continue its triumph and dominance.
The guests do both agree that the argument being made is not the popularity argument, but how it became popular is what's important. How did Christianity become popular when it supposedly didn't do what Islam did? Well, offering something uniquely attractive would work. All religions have a unique selling point, so maybe Christianity's post-life perfection was more attractive than that of other competing religions. And then, in the 4th century, it got a major boost when Emperor Constantine converted. Having your religion approved by the emperor will give it a major advantage over all competitors. Christianity has now made the big time. No resurrection miracles required.
I think a skeptic could say, well, the tomb was empty, and it was empty because it was robbed, and then they could cite all the evidence for tombs being robbed, and there is a lot of evidence for that in antiquity. And then they could refer to, we talked about visions, so they could take a different view than I do, and they could say, well, yeah, you're right, Allison, it's vision-like, but that's because they were mostly hallucinations.
I don't know anyone who says this seriously. Yes, I have seen these ideas mentioned, but mostly by Christians who are looking for examples of things they can dismiss. Additionally, I have seen them proposed by those who wish to mock, but not by anyone who is positing a serious reason to doubt. It's far more likely that you'll hear the suggestion that Jesus was put into a mass grave, like every other crucified criminal, and the appearances attributed to later fabrications. This scenario is far more likely in my opinion.
There are historical events for which I have no explanation, and I don't accept the religious explanation. So there's a whole chapter in my book on an event that took place, or a series of events, in Zaytun, Egypt in 1968. And these are appearances of Mary. And there were tens of thousands of people who saw this, secular, Muslim, Christian. And I've read the accounts, I've looked at the pictures, I've talked to people involved, and I look at this, and the Coptic Christian will say, this is Mary, and you just can't see what's obvious. And I look at it, and I say, I don't know what the heck this is. I have no explanation, but I'm not ready to bet that it's Mary. So there's also that option, Justin, that is of looking at this and saying, you know what, Justin, I don't really have a good alternative scenario, but I prefer agnosticism because I'm just not willing to go there. That's not totally unreasonable, because I think it's the case for some things I've confronted as an historian. I don't know what to do with them.
But a single Bible verse from 2,000 years ago that says 500 people saw the risen Jesus is totally true. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.